good to see you all this morning. My name is Rick. I'm one of the pastors here at Hope Church. I have to kind of share that at the front. I've been here for 14 years. Some of you may have meeting me for the first time because I spend most of my time at the Mount Laurel campus, but I'm really glad that I'm back with you this morning. I had to preach twice, though, once in Mount Laurel, so I'm going to just do my best to just keep the energy level. Just kidding, I'll be fine. But I'm glad that I'm here with you. It's exciting. I look forward to this time as we continue in this series that we're calling What Counts. It's when we count something, that means that we place value on it, right? And we all do that. We all count different things. As a matter of fact, here in this building right now, while you're sitting here, there is counting that's taking place. There's someone in the back over there who's counting the backs of heads. And we're counting those, and someone is out in the kids ministry wing, and they're counting as well, and they're counting those little heads. And then there's even people, we just received an offering, and so that is being counted as well. And so we count all sorts of different things, and when we count them, we're kind of placing some value on those things. So what counts in church world? And so last week we were talking about that influence counts, that we who are we influencing and how are we influencing? The other thing that's interesting about counting is that when pastors get together, we talk about things that we count as well. When pastors get together, this is usually what we talk about. We talk about bucks, butts, budgets, and buildings. Bucks, budgets, and buildings. Yeah, and sadly, those are not things that Paul talks about with Timothy, but for some reason, that's what pastors end up talking about often when they're together. One thing that I think is interesting that I want to mention is, did you see on Facebook, if you follow our Facebook page, that there was someone who figured out what really counts? She's 7 years old. And she decided for her 7th birthday that instead of birthday gifts, she wanted her family and friends to make donations to our Hope's Food Pantry. And so on Monday, this 7-year-old delivered all of those items that were for her 7-year-old birthday. She knows what counts, doesn't she? Right? Yeah, it's worth clapping for. Yeah, so that was pretty neat. I was here when that was going on, and I didn't get in the picture, but I was here, and it was exciting to see them bring all those things in that were from her birthday party. So we're using Paul's letter to Timothy. He actually wrote 2 letters. We're using those letters as our framework for this series, and early on in that first letter, Paul tells Timothy, here's why I'm writing to you, and here's the reason. And the reason that Paul was writing these letters to Timothy is that there was some teaching that was going on in the church or near the church that was causing an influence on what the church was teaching. So the church teaches about Jesus, and there was some other teaching that was taking place in the city of Ephesus, that was different and was causing some controversy. It was contrary to the teachings of the truth, Paul says. And so Paul is concerned with that teaching. So if you're reading through the letters that Paul wrote to Timothy while we're in this series, I know at least one small group that's doing it. It's a great thing to do. You just kind of read through the letters or read through the chapter or the book of the Bible that we're preaching on. I love when I hear that people are doing that. So as you're doing that, though, if you're reading through the Timothy letters, in the first letter that Timothy wrote, in the 2nd chapter, you come upon this place where Paul is writing to Timothy, and he's saying some things that can cause you a pause or say, hey, wait a minute, where do we fall in that as this church called Hope? And if you read in that 2nd chapter, it seems as if Paul is saying that women need to appear modest, they need to wear certain types of clothing and hairstyles and jewelry, and there's even a verse about being quiet and not teaching men. Now, obviously, here at Hope, we don't follow this teaching from Paul to Timothy. We have plenty of women who are leading and plenty of women who are teaching and have authority here at the church. And we don't adhere to a dress code policy. Thank goodness, this is as dressed up as I can get. All right? We also don't have concerns about hair, which, again, big relief. All right? And we just don't have those kinds of concerns. So the question, though, that follows is, so why is it in there? Or if it's in there, why don't we have to follow it? So I give you 3 words that I think will help in understanding, especially that chapter, but also all the chapters in the Bible. The 3 words are background, context, and meaning. So some things that are important about the background that's going on behind the scenes with Paul and Timothy. So Timothy is a young pastor in the city of Ephesus. And Ephesus is the world center for Artemis worship. Now, Artemis was a female goddess of fertility, and it was her world headquarters in Ephesus. So the majority of those who lived in Ephesus were Artemis worshipers and knew about Artemis, and you were required, if you lived in that city and had a business, to be an Artemis worshiper. And so Artemis was the teaching that Paul was concerned about that was going on in that city in that time. It was contrary to Jesus. Artemis was also only led by female priestess. And if a male wanted to be a priest in the Artemis worship setting, he had to go through ritual castration process. Yeah, oh, and the crowd went wild. Yeah. Yeah, so all of that is the background for what's going on when Paul is writing this letter to Timothy. Some context is also important. So some context is this is a personal letter that Paul was writing to Timothy. Paul wrote lots of letters. Often he wrote to churches. So he wrote a letter to the Colossian church. He wrote to the Ephesian church. He wrote to the Philippian church. And when those letters were written, they would be read out loud to the congregations. But when Paul was writing to Timothy, it's a personal letter that Paul was writing. So when we're reading it, it's as if we're reading Timothy's mail. And we're also, it's as if we got his Gmail password and we're looking at his email, right? Because we don't get letters anymore, we get emails. And so that's the way we have to understand the context of this letter that Paul wrote to Timothy. And Timothy's mandate was to correct the teaching that's taking place in the city of Ephesus. So that's background and context. And then the third piece is meaning. There's some Greek words that Paul uses. There's one specific Greek word that Paul uses about authority, and that word is only used in that letter to Timothy. There were several other words about authority that have the same meaning or similar meaning as authority, but Paul chooses not to use those words. He only uses this one particular word. And if you want to know more about that, I'm not going to tell you. But you can read about it because Randy Peterson wrote up a really nice paper, a nice one-page paper on the 2nd chapter of 1 Timothy. We have it out in the lobby. You can grab that on the way out the door. But if you want to talk more about why Paul said those things and what they mean, I would love to talk to you afterward, after worship, or again, check out that article from Randy. It's at the info desk, and I think it's scattered around. And, excuse me, that was all a commercial break. Now we move on to preaching. So as I read the stories of Jesus, I notice there's a pattern that Jesus followed. I'll talk about this. It's kind of, again, background before we get to the letter that Paul wrote to Timothy. So as Jesus practiced this pattern, I noticed that he did it in every time he met with people. Jesus was drawn towards people who were far away from God. People who were far away or felt they were far away from God. Jesus was drawn to be near them. So when Jesus is having conversations with a woman from Samaria, that's someone who she felt she was far from God, and Jesus was drawn towards her. Jesus was drawn towards the blind people. He was drawn towards lepers. He was drawn towards those who were demon-possessed. And all of those people would have been classified as far from God, but yet Jesus was drawn to be near people like that. Jesus even had a conversation with a man called that we call the rich young ruler. And when Jesus met with that gentleman, he walked away because he couldn't follow through on the commitments that Jesus was suggesting, the challenges that Jesus was suggesting. But yet it says that Jesus loved him, even though this guy wasn't going to follow through on these challenges. And so what I notice is that Jesus understood that we have this need for belonging as people. That we want to feel a sense of belonging. What would it be like for someone who believes that they're far from God and they can't be near God to find out that there is God wants to be near to them? Imagine what that experience would be like. And so this idea that Jesus demonstrated was, this practice is that people who are far from God can be drawn near to God and they can feel that they can belong. So I decided early on in ministry that I was going to practice that technique. And so one of the things I would do is find ways to invite people to be part of community, right? It's what we do here at Hope all the time as well. We want people to feel that they can belong. So before I became a pastor here, I was a youth pastor at another church. And when I was pastoring at that church, we started our youth ministry. And it was a small youth ministry that had 15 or 20 students. And they were all church kids. And as we spent time there and started growing and started doing some things, we noticed more and more kids were coming. And it was just the exciting thing that happens in the youth pastor's heart is to find out that students that you're meeting with were engaged and inspired and enjoyed their experience so much that when they went to school, they talked about their experience and they wanted their friends to come to church with them. And so we found that we had kids, church kids, were inviting not church kids to come to church. And so we had this thing on Wednesday night where we did a worship service, very similar to what happens here on Sunday nights called Sunday Night Live, where there's a youth band and there's youth kind of things going on, but a youth worship service. And we were doing the same kind of thing on Wednesday nights. And we had students who were bringing their friends to church. And I'm like, this is exactly what it's all about. This is what the church is supposed to be. People who are far from God can be invited to belong and feel part of something. And so I thought this was just exciting and wonderful. So when you bring non-church kids into the church, non-church kids don't know how the church functions or how the church works. And so non-church kids will do things that church people aren't used to having happen. And so there was one time, there was this mom who was there with her kid for something else younger, and she came up to me, she said, Pastor Rick, can I talk to you? And I said, yeah, what's up? And she said, there's a lot of kids in the building. And I'm like, yeah, there sure are. There was like 100 of them. I'm like, there's lots of kids in the building. She said, some of them are using foul language. And I said, only some of them? Like, yeah, that's pretty good for us, right? Yeah. And she said, and they're kind of rude. Yeah, but guess what? I said, there are 3,000 kids in the high school, and 100 of them are choosing to come to church on Wednesday night. Isn't that a good thing? She didn't think so. She missed the idea of belonging. Jesus understood that. Jesus practiced that. He wanted people to belong. And what happened in these relationships that Jesus built with people is as they felt that they could belong, there became this moment where they believed. So the woman at the well that Jesus spoke to has this experience of belonging, and then there's this belief that takes place in her life. There's people throughout the stories of Jesus who began to believe that Jesus not only was inviting them to be part of community with him, but he was inviting them to a changed life. And so there's this sense of belonging that became belief. That's where the story of the rich young ruler becomes so sad, is that he was loved by Jesus, but yet he chose to walk away. And so there's this idea of belonging. No matter where you are, no matter how far you're away, no matter how you feel about God. And then there's this moment where you can believe. And then we believe here, and I see it in the stories of Jesus as well, is that from belonging to belief, there's becoming. And there's this life transformation that takes place. Here we say we're in the process of being conformed to the image of Jesus Christ for the sake of others. That there's this becoming that takes place in our lives, and our lives change. And you can see that through all the stories of Jesus, as the people that he meets, that there's this sense of belonging that turns into belief that becomes becoming. And really, that's no different than most relationships. My wife and I, Kelly, have been married almost 30 years. It'll be 30 years in August. And when we met, we weren't married. Right? You get that? Right? See where I'm going here? All right. When we met, it was Rick and Kelly. And I wanted to belong. You know what I mean? And so we began by belonging. We started liking each other. And it was Rick and Kelly, and it became Rick and Kelly. And then somewhere along in that belonging time, we started to believe in this relationship. We started to believe that there was Rick and Kelly, but Rick and Kelly was better, and I liked that as well. And so we went from belonging to believing, and we started to believe in that relationship, that it was going to be a Rick and Kelly thing. And then as that happened, as we went from belonging to believing, it also became, I got to stop using became, we started to become Rick and Kelly. So I noticed in my life that it started out that it was only making decisions about me, and now it was decisions about Rick and Kelly. And I had to change how I thought about and lived life. See how that's so similar to our spiritual lives? We start out belonging, and then we believe, and then we become. Our life is transformed. And it happens in every relationship. So surprisingly, Jesus is doing this thing in ministry that is so connected to the way that we relate with each other. We want to feel this sense of belonging. We want to believe. And that belief leads us to life transformation. So that's all the background before we get to what Paul had to say to Timothy. It's up on the screen. He writes in 2 Timothy chapter 2, verse 14, repeat these basic essentials over and over to God's people. Now, I'm reading it from the Message version because I think it sounds so much like a letter. It just works really well. Repeat these basic essentials over and over to God's people. Warn them before God against pious nitpicking, which chips away at the faith. It just wears everyone out, Paul says. Concentrate on doing your best for God. Work you won't be ashamed of. Laying out the truth plain and simple. Stay clear of pious talk that is only talk. Words are not mere words, you know. If they're not backed by a godly life, they accumulate as poison in the soul. Now remember, Paul is writing to Timothy because there's some bad teaching that's taking place in Ephesus, the whole Artemis thing's going on, and people are hearing conflicting ideas as truth, which can cause some uncertainty and some doubt and some unbelief. And so Paul says, this is what matters, Timothy. What we teach, how we communicate Jesus to the world matters. And so Paul tells Timothy, repeat these basic essentials over and over. And if you read the verses before that I just read, those verses before, Paul is talking about Jesus. So he says, Timothy, talk about Jesus, Jesus, Jesus. And then when you're done, talk about Jesus some more. Repeat that over and over and over again, Timothy. Just talk about Jesus. Concentrate on doing your best for God. And then words need to be backed by a godly life. Now, this is not about standing on a street corner or knocking on doors to tell others about Jesus. It's about how we live and how we practice our life at home and work and school. See, what's fascinating, in the first century, the church was growing exponentially. People were coming to Jesus over and over and over again, and it just kept happening. And at the time, there were no church buildings. There were no professional pastors with theological educations. There was just a guy like Timothy who had just grown up in the church, and Paul said, "You're in charge now." And yet somehow, the church was growing exponentially. The argument is easily made that the reason the church was growing is that the way that the men and women were living in the cities and in the towns was different than the world around them. See, again, we're in Ephesus, and Artemis worship is all around, and everyone there is part of the Artemis worship because Artemis was a fertility god. So if you wanted children and crops, you needed to worship Artemis. And Paul says, here's the basic essential, Timothy. It's Jesus, Jesus, Jesus. Talk about Jesus, Timothy. Live your life about Jesus. And the world will see how you live, and the world will be drawn towards it. There was open hostility towards Christ followers, both socially and politically. But yet, if you talk about Jesus, if you live your life around Jesus, if you choose to live like Jesus, Timothy, it will grow and grow and grow. And so people saw how these Ephesian Christians were living. They lived this different life, so much so that in Acts, the people who were the early church were called the Way because they were living the way of Jesus. They were living like Jesus. And so this lifestyle evangelism in the first century, I would argue, is just as important, if not more important, in the 21st century. The church worldwide is considered irrelevant, judgmental, overly political, sheltered, hypocritical, and homophobic. I would argue that the lives that we live matter. And that the best teaching that we can do is to teach what it means to live a life with Jesus. That we can invite people to belong. And Hope, we're so good at that. We love inviting people to belong. We do events over and over and over again where we are inviting people to belong, where we're inviting you to invite people. So things like our tree lightings and even our preschool and kids environments, our last week's Super Bowl party even, summer concerts, our Sunday morning lobby with that giant info desk is there for a reason because we want people to easily be able to get connected so that they can feel that they belong. The reason we have a campus in Mount Laurel is because we think that there are people in Mount Laurel who need to belong to a community of faith, and we want people to belong. That's why we do the things that we do. We want to invite people to belong. And we think this is a great place to belong, don't we? I've been coming here since you guys started paying me. 14 years, almost 15 years in January. And I love this place. I love being here. I love being a part of here. I have no intention of going anywhere else. I think there's great things that we do here. I am proud to be on staff and to be a pastor at this place. But I want to share with you that there is something even better than hope. That belonging here is really good and that people can feel connected. But we want people to feel that they can belong because we want them to believe in Jesus. Because Jesus makes all the difference in the world. Amen? This is a great place and we want people to belong. But we want them to belong because we want them to believe that Jesus loves them no matter where they've been, no matter what they've done, and no matter what they've thought about God in the past. I know that Jesus changed my life. I know that Jesus has changed your lives as well. I believe that my relationship with Jesus has been and always will be the best thing that has ever happened in my life. And this is the only reason that we challenge you to invite others here is because we want others to experience Jesus as well. And we believe when they feel that the warmth and the friendliness and the comfort of belonging in a community of faith like this, that they'll want to know what makes this place different, what makes it tick in a sense. And if you're here and you say, hey, I feel that belonging, but I'm not believing yet, you're in the perfect place. We're so glad that you're here because we are sure that you spend enough time here, you are going to discover that there's a God that loves you more than life itself. And so we believe Jesus changes lives. Hope doesn't change lives. Jesus changes lives. It's Jesus' job, and it always will be, because we are in the process of being conformed to the image of Jesus Christ for the sake of others. And when we are in that process, we discover that after we felt this sense of belonging and we begin to believe that it's possible that Jesus would love us and forgive us, that we realize we're becoming like Jesus. And that's where this life change takes place. This is where we discover that we can be good teachers of the word. Because where we live can be influenced by our lives. The places that we work, the schools that we attend. People are watching how we live our lives. And they're noting how we live them differently. It has an impact on our world. And it changes people's lives. So let me read to you from Paul one more time to Timothy. I want to try to bring it into the 21st century. He says, repeat these basic essentials over and over to God's people. Jesus, Jesus, Jesus. We live in this world that's isolated and polarized currently. It's a world of extremes, where if you want to belong, you have to believe what I believe first. And yet the church is offering a countercultural message. We're saying you can belong. You can be a part of this. And we can choose to believe different things. There's this incredible mistrust of the church, and the church is at best irrelevant. At best, it's fairy tales. Paul says, concentrate on doing your best for God. Work you won't be ashamed of, laying out the truth plain and simple, that we can belong without believing. Let's have a friendship, a genuine, honest relationship, no strings attached. That's the way Jesus modeled this lifestyle. He said that there are people who are far from God, and yet we can draw them nearer, and we can choose to be near them and bring them close to God. Paul's challenge is that we can repeat what is most important is belonging. It leads to belief, and backed by a godly life. In other words, the way that we choose, what we profess on Sunday is lived out Monday through Saturday. It changes the world around us. I have this challenge as a pastor of a church. I hang out with all church people. Everybody I work with goes to church. You know? And 95% of the people in this room, maybe more, don't work at a church. So there are people, men and women, that you see that I will never see, that the staff here will never see. And they're already uncomfortable around, especially the kiss of death conversation. What do you do for a living? Oh, I'm a pastor. Cricket, cricket, cricket. You know? There are men and women that you will see, that you work with, you go to school with, that you run into in your neighborhoods, who may never come through these doors. But yet a sense of belonging can lead to belief and becoming. but they're watching how you live your life. And they'll be drawn towards you. They'll say, how is it possible during trauma, during drama, and when struggle, yet they're confident, and they have this faith that is it seems real. They're living this way of life that's different. And they'll be drawn to conversations about what that is and what that looks like. And I would hope during those conversations that you would share about the belonging you felt at Hope or other places, and the belief that you found in Jesus, and that Jesus is causing this transformation so that you're becoming this new life that's abundant, that's fruit-filled and life-giving. The band's going to come up, they're going to lead us in a closing song. It's a song about Jesus, surprisingly. And I just want to close with this idea that there's this life cycle that seems to take place in the church, and I believe, again, it's part of God's plan, is that as we have this sense of belonging, that this belonging, this realization that even though I feel far from God, I can still be part of this community. As that turns into belief and that turns into becoming, we are in the process of being conformed to the image of Jesus Christ. What's the last part? It's the part everybody remembers, right? Yeah, for the sake of others. It's this life cycle that takes place, that we get to introduce others to community and belonging, and introduce others to this life of faith through Jesus. And I am fascinated by the work that God continues to do in this place, and because of this place, and through your lives. And I know that God's going to continue. Amen.